Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Number one thing that you want to know, I'm going to tell you right off from the top. I'm not related to Donald Trump. Usually the number one question, especially on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I will also save you the long bio, but just to share with you the frame that I'm looking at things through this afternoon. My background includes actually starting out in Cleveland City School System in Ohio with the Safety and Security Division. I worked at the junior high school levels. I was an investigator, created and supervised a youth gang unit for 5 of us for 127 schools, 73,000 students. Then we did everything from talk with second graders about why they shouldn't be in gangs to sharing information with the city gang unit and doing enforcement investigative activities to teacher training, etc. I worked in a suburban school district, 15,000 students, 21 school sites as director of security and assistant director of a federal-funded anti-gang project and school safety project. I did a lot of training and consulting on a part-time basis at that time and expanded that more than 20-some years ago into a full-time business where we do school security assessments, emergency planning, professional development, training with schools. So my perspective is from a consultative. I also do some litigation consulting. A national perspective, but working hands-on with school administrators, first responders, and their community partners. And I also have had the opportunity to testify. My master's is in public administration, so I'm going to try to give you a few thoughts from the policy and funding area and some things that I look at in terms of what's done at the state and federal level as well. I'm also a father, a 50-year-old father of 2 young children, so I'll be working until I'm 90, God willing. School safety certainly looks as important, if not more so, from the dad's perspective as well. Where are we, and particularly after Sandy Hook? Sandy Hook left teachers and educators, parents, and everyone in this country emotionally raw, and still that way, and fueled even more by the incidents in Decatur, Georgia, with the gunman that went into an elementary school that was talked down by a bookkeeper, and all of the other high-profile incidents from the Navy. It just adds on to that emotional rawness that we never really have gotten over, and I'm not sure that we ever will because of Sandy Hook. And what's happened now is it's leaving your constituents, parents, everyone, the media, everyone's looking for wow, but we're not thinking about how. We've seen a lot of well-intended suggestions, but a lot of things that are well-intended but not well thought out. Some of that reflected in legislation, some of that reflected in practice. Bulletproof backpacks, ballistic whiteboards, are some of the things. There was just a kit by a vendor, and I was interviewed for the Hartford newspaper in Connecticut where they have a stun gun, a ladder, I forgot what else was on the list. You know, as a father, my first question is if my child needs a bulletproof backpack, wouldn't they need a bulletproof front pack, a ballistic helmet, and a Captain America shield to go with it? How does this stuff work in implementation? If a kid needs a bulletproof backpack, somebody forgot to tell the vendors that, guess what? Most school administrators, if you actually understood schools, have their kids keep their backpacks in their locker all day. I just envision the kid bouncing the ball down the gym class with the bulletproof bag. This stuff, you know, the teacher with the whiteboards, some of you may have seen, or, you know, they're certainly bigger than this, but what do? All 26 of you line up behind me and make sure this is where your straight line training really comes in handy, kids? But these are the conversations that we're having around, in some places around the country, and I can assure you, in the media. I have done more interviews with national media to the point where I feel like I have to be out there for the voice of it, to be a voice of reason, but sometimes I'm wondering, why am I talking in the world in conversation of insanity? So the question is, how do we address these issues? Other extreme ideas, Alice training, and while the run, hide, and fight may make sense in some adult settings, there's a program that's being sold by a company out called Alice training, alert, lock down, inform, counter, and evacuate. You're going in and teaching children to throw things at and attack armed intruders. You know, and let me tell you, it's going like wildfire. It's the hot, you know. But what about children who have age and development? My focus is on implementation, and I'm giving you these examples because my last point to you today is going to be just that. Well-intended ideas, people may have brought things to you, but what does it mean in implementation as you think of legislation? Will it work for a school? Will it help a principal make her or his school safer? How will it be implemented, and does it make practical common sense? Legislatively, we know that back in April, Education Week magazine tallied up at least 400 state bills across the country of various types of legislation. If you go to Education Week, edweek.org, look at the April 24th issue, it'll give you a breakdown on emergency planning, police and school, arming school employees, easing gun restrictions, building safety upgrades, school climate and student supports, gun control, and the list goes on. I think that a lot of things, unfortunately, missed the mark in this legislation, and we have to make sure that whatever you do is a balance of hardware and hardware, not a one-shot deal. And some things that you've looked at, I really like the breakdown in Connecticut and how you tackle this, because we get tunnel vision focus in our legislation a lot of times, a one-shot approach, one issue. But by breaking down the gun control and keeping school safety and the mental health dissected, but still a part of a comprehensive approach, is a very wise way to approach this, along with the things that Susan's talked about in Colorado. How do you get that balance of hardware and hardware, the technology, the human aspect of school safety, and still address the broader issues, but not, and many of them politically sensitive, but also do things and do it in a way that'll help people on the front lines. Let's talk about prior to Sandy Hook. Where were we in the 3 to 5 years prior to Sandy Hook? What I saw across the country, and many of my colleagues, is a clear relationship in the field. Due to cut funding from the federal through the state and down to the local levels, we saw a decreased focus on prevention, intervention, security, preparedness, training, and other strategies. And what did we see on the other side? Increase in serious incidents, increase in lawsuits, increase in parent and media concerns. I can tell you that I could track very clearly the number of calls for preventative, proactive support services for school safety, training, assessments, emergency planning, preventative activities, decreasing as the number of calls I got increased from attorneys due to lawsuits for negligent security, mishandling of bullying incidents, and other safety concerns. It's no coincidence. Many of the lessons that were learned after Columbine fell to the wayside in the 5 years or so prior to Sandy Hook. And I guess one of my other disclaimers I should have said in my introductions is one of the advantages of being self-employed as a private entity is I can say absolutely anything up here. I do not have to be reelected or elected. I am not fired by a school board or a superintendent or police chief, so I'm going to tell you like it is as we go through this. Respectfully so, but this is the situation that we were dealing with. What are some of the challenges that we saw and continue to see in school districts on the front line of our schools, ranging from many of the things that you've heard: active shooters, lone wolf actors, irate parents, disgruntled employees, threats, social media, crisis communications. I'm not going to belabor these points. They were very well covered in the prior presentations. Increased lawsuits, bullying, negligent security, chronic violent offenders who remained in schools and caused harm to children and teachers, supervision, negligent supervision. These are the issues that our people are dealing with on the front lines of education and have been for a number of years, particularly prior to Sandy Hook. What should we be focusing on, and what should you focus on in terms of, as you approach legislation, as you look at programs and funding, what should schools be doing? What we found is that as we talk about, even after Sandy Hook, about these high-level wild ideas of bulletproof backpacks and teaching kids to attack armed intruders. I was in Wisconsin at a state attorney general's conference as a keynote speaker, and in one of the breakout sessions, I had a deputy come up to me and say that some of the teachers in one of the schools that his department serves told the children at the elementary school to go home and get a can of soup and put it in their desk to throw things at and attack armed intruders. Well, I have news for you. As a father of 2 young kids, If I know one thing for sure, you can't get a group of 20, 12-year-olds to simultaneously agree to attack chicken nuggets or pizza for lunch, much less to attack an armed gunman. So are we talking about practical things? We're having all these conversations on these extreme ideas, and guess what people are not doing on the front lines? Training their school employees, their first responders, and their partners, whether it's the mental health piece, security, and emergency planning. Most schools had crisis plans, certainly after Columbine, but we have found even in those states where legislatively or by State Board of Education rule, the plans were supposed to be updated annually by the laws that you create or the regulations that are set forth by State Board rules. We've gone into school districts that are certifying to the state superintendent that their school emergency plans are updated annually and have found plans dated back 4 or 5 years ago. I was just in a school district last week in 2013 that had a plan dated 1999, 5 of 1999. In a state that requires them to be updated annually. Are you not only conducting lockdown drills? Many of you or your colleagues at the state level have passed legislation requiring different types of drills be enacted, as Representative mentioned earlier. That's good, but what we know from practice is that there are a few carrots and no sticks to see attached to that. And schools are, in many cases, going through the motions of doing the drills at best, not diversifying the drills. I had a teacher in a principal certification class at Cleveland State University tell me that as a teacher, she thought the only time a fire could ever occur in school was at 9:12 in the morning because that's the only time her principal would ever do a fire drill. Yet we worked in a school in Pennsylvania where a kid brought an AK-47 to school, fired a couple of rounds in the hallway, and committed suicide between class change. And one of the things that the kids told us was that they didn't know what to do between the class change because they'd never been trained. And guess what time of the school day you will rarely find a lockdown drill being practiced? Anyone want to guess? During lunchtime. Why? Because it's an inconvenience to the adults. But guess what? In many schools, if you take the start of their first lunch period and the end of their last lunch period, it's 30 to 40% of their entire school day. So while you have the laws that they have to practice lockdown, on the ground level, in reality, they're not diversifying their drills. Simple things, blocking exits on fire drills, taking teachers or students out of line, doing a lockdown between class change. You don't need to have a SWAT team and a strip search at the kindergarten door, but we do need to diversify our drills. Like everyone said, I'm also a father. I advocate this, but I don't want a hostile prison-like environment because I'm also a strong believer in climate supportive and welcoming environments. But there are some things you can do because that teacher who's taught from that same classroom for 26 years and goes out the same exit for 26 years, 10 times a year on a fire drill, is not going to be able to think on his or her feet if they do the same thing, rote behaviors over and over again. Diversifying your drills, tabletop exercises, the scenario-based situations that Susan talked about. Get the plans off the shelf and into practice. Because technically, they're in compliance with the well-intended laws that you pass. They can check a box and send it to the State Department of Ed and say, yep, we did it. But is it in compliance with the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? And I suggest to you that in many cases, largely due to the fact that the schools do have legitimate competing interests with all the laws we're also passing on meeting test scores and academics, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. All I'm saying is there are competing interests, many of them things that you deal with from a legislative perspective, and the schools are scratching the surface on implementation. Conducting tabletops drills, assessing their security and the crisis plans, and making reasonable upgrades. The infrastructure is part of it, but I'll be very candid in saying that I think we desperately need to do that. When the doors are falling off the building, it's not hard to figure out where we have a problem. And the PA system, like the one the other day, is 55 years old in the school. there are some legitimate issues that need to be addressed on the hardware, the infrastructure, and that piece. But be very cautious, especially in this emotional state now, because what's happening is we're doing those one-shot hits at the state level in particular, where we're throwing money at $5 million over a couple of years on security piece. That's good, but are you also dealing with the mental health and the people end? Because what's happened, and I'll get into this in a second, crisis communication, social media, and related plans. The impact, to reiterate what Susan said, of social media cannot be overstated. Many of the school superintendents that we're working with and principals are dealing more with the rumors, the Facebook threats, the rumors, the texting about an incident or a threat than they have to deal with the threat itself. The threats may be small, the problems are small, but the life within the community, thanks to social media, rumors, text messaging, outgrows the problem itself. We're working more on crisis communications plans along with the security planning and emergency planning than ever in the past. Engaging students, student training, student-led safety discussions, student-led problems or projects. I know a colleague of mine who's Kurt Lavarello, who co-founded the National Association of School Resource Officers, always tells the story of when he was a school resource officer in a high school, how they were having problems out in the parking lot of a large high school in Florida where the cars were being vandalized or stolen. So they had their little safety committee. They got their people together, had a student involved, and one adult says, we need to buy more cameras. Another one says, maybe we need to put an officer. Finally, after 15 minutes, they got around to a student who raised her hand, and she says, why don't you just talk to Johnny Jones? He's the one that's breaking into the cars. Sometimes the students have some really simple solutions. Perhaps that's a little oversimplified, but if we're not talking to kids, we're not going to figure this out. Reaching out to non-traditional community partners. Columbine taught us to reach out to first responders, particularly with police and fire and EMS. We've learned, along with that, working with your emergency management agencies. You'll see in some of my closing recommendations here about engaging your Homeland Security and emergency management in policy and programmatic discussions. Mental health, certainly. And that last line, balancing, prevention, intervention, climate, security, policing, preparedness, and partnering. Because what we do is we go to one extreme or the other. We look at this as we need more prevention or better security instead of more prevention and better security. You can put all of the prevention programs in your school that you want, all of the counseling, all of the positive behavior intervention supports, and everything else. But if Johnny gets beaten up, attacked, or stabbed in the back hallway on his way to the counselor's office or psychologist's office, if you're lucky enough to have one, your programs are useless. Maslow 101. You have to have a secure environment in order to deliver prevention, intervention, and education. You need to have not just the security, though, you need to have the supportive climate and intervention services to balance it out to make a welcoming and supportive environment. From a policy and federal, state, and local level, what I've seen over recent years, 5 years prior to Sandy Hook, and this is not a political, none of this is a political statement on my part. It's a description of the politics, not a personal jab at, for or on behalf of one party or the other. At the federal level, the administration and Congress, many of us know they're not working too well together. Unfortunately, they did a great job of working well together at eliminating safe and drug-free schools, the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools REMS grant. I don't know how at the federal level we can eliminate school emergency planning, but we did it. They eliminated Safe Schools, Healthy Students by and large, school resource officers, community cops in schools program, training for school resource officers, Safe Schools, Healthy Students, the mental health piece, all of those disappeared over a period of 5 years, up until Sandy Hook. What happened after Sandy Hook is the president attempted to introduce a restoration, not at the level of what the cuts were made, but as part of his response after, for the administration after Sandy Hook. The problem is that got couched in the debate of gun control versus gun rights, and it sits dead now. It was dead on arrival because it got nowhere. So for the last 9 months from the federal level, we haven't seen one program really restored that was cut, and it's DOA, dead on arrival, because of the gun debate. Again, a description, not a criticism, just what we're seeing on the front lines. Versus back in the days after Columbine, there was pretty much a bipartisan effort, again, such as you described at the state level in Connecticut, where the Clinton administration and Congress put aside the partisanship and created those very programs that I just talked about being cut. Cops in schools, readiness emergency management for schools, safe schools, healthy students. So at the federal level, in essence, the schools had pretty much nothing, except for the last 5 years, there's been a very skewed emphasis on bullying. Think about it. For the last 5 years, what did you hear legislatively and in the media? Bullying, 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 bullying. And what happens is we're a roller coaster society. We have roller coaster awareness, roller coaster policy, and roller coaster funding based on the anecdote of the day. Not that bullying isn't an issue. It's hit home with my own children. I became very critical of the skewed focus and was sometimes criticized and mislabeled as being anti-bullying, if you could ever believe that. My argument always was not that we have policy and legislation and funding and programs to address anti-bullying. Mine is that we don't have skewed policy and drop everything else and throw it out the window to address one issue. And in many cases, especially as budgets tightened at the state and federal level, that's what happened with policy and funding. So we're all in the bullying bandwagon up until Sandy Hook. And then December 15th on, you may hear bullying as a passing issue, except for those of us who are actually dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So, at federal level, things are pretty much in limbo, and I don't see that changing, which I think is a national embarrassment myself. At the state level, we've seen a variety of responses. Many of the states had also eliminated a lot of the prevention, intervention, policing, and security and emergency response programs due to budget cuts over the years. Bullying also at the state level had a tunnel vision focus in many cases. We've seen some legislation that may be well-intended, not well thought out, in my opinion, and that covers a variety of areas. Some things that, quite frankly, may make good political sense in changing some of the gun laws. Again, not a political statement on arming teachers. How many school districts really picked up on that, even when we adapted our state laws? I support Second Amendment. I support concealed carry. I don't want an armed teacher in my kid's school. It has nothing to do with my gun political preferences. It has to do with the fact that there's much more to it than carrying a gun. There's a training and a mindset that goes behind that. I'll take a trained school resource officer any day. So we're getting into all these other things, but it really hasn't helped on the front line, one way or the other. Again, we've seen some state legislation, one that I'm still scratching my head on. Again, well-intended, not well thought out. The answer at the state level is let's pass a state law that will allow local districts to put a levy on the ballot for school security. So it's kind of passing that buck. So from the state level down, and the local school boards are going, yeah, it's not going to happen. Not when we have all these other competing interests. So we're still sort of, again, in limbo. And meanwhile, at the local level, and the other thing is there's nothing wrong with beefing up security, but I've seen some one-shot hits, if you will, one-time deals where we throw some money at security equipment, but we're forgetting about the people aspect and not having the comprehensiveness that you see in Connecticut and Colorado. The other aspect that's going on politically is that school safety has been politicized. In the last 10 years, especially after Columbine, it has now become a political tool for many areas that, quite frankly, aren't helping on the front level. I mean, we have seen everything from product vendors lobbying state legislatures to pass certain laws that will have advantageous business benefits for them to promote their particular products or services, to special interest groups that are advocating for particular issues or causes. The LGBT community was largely behind bullying laws. The bullying laws really weren't, quite honestly, to deal with bullying as much as exclusively as they were to also deal with enumeration issues and creating state laws that addressed their particular agenda. Again, not a political statement, a reality. At the same time, we have a great deal of lobbying now in politics around student suspensions, expulsions, and police officers out of schools, the so-called school-to-prison pipeline. Interestingly enough, but, you know, in those recommendations, what we see schools do, not that there aren't legitimate issues, but what we see schools do is they respond to politics and your legislation from one extreme to the other. If there's political pressure to reduce suspensions and expulsions, their answer, in many cases, to get their statistics good is not that they're dealing with the problem, they're dealing with the numbers. The idea of throwing police officers out of school, in my opinion, is not only tone deaf to what America's parents want, but it fails to recognize that the issue is not necessarily the police officer in the school. It's what officer do you have do you have an officer that wants to be there? Do you have a program that has sound policies and procedures and memorandum of understanding? I was in a school district just recently where we were dealing with an issue to evaluate school police, and there was a controversy and some butting heads in this district because they had issues with disproportionate suspensions and expulsions and some concerns with arrests. The answer on the school end was just move the officers out of the high school and put them in elementary school, sort of just get rid of them so they put them somewhere and that'll make our numbers go down. They had PBIS, Positive Behavioral Intervention Supports Program, they just introduced. The officers they felt were not lining up with the expectations on their discipline. So, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Here's the point I'm getting to. When we interviewed the police officers, they've never been trained on PBIS. They've never been in any policy discussions about what the district was where they were going with their new behavior program and their goals to deal with suspensions and expulsions and arrest. Here's a wild concept. Sit down and talk with each other. But yet, we have, and many of you are being lobbied to create state laws that basically get the police officers out of school, just get rid of the police. So it's not one extreme or the other, folks. It's how you implement it. Zero tolerance. We need new laws that prohibit zero tolerance. I always wanted to ask, what did we have before zero tolerance? A 50% tolerance for violence in schools? 75%? Most school boards and districts and administrators strive for firm, fair, and consistent discipline applied with good common sense. We can supply you, as do many of the special interest groups, with all kinds of examples where the latter is missing, the lack of common sense. Now, if any of you in this room have found a way to legislate common sense, I would love to take you on a road tour with me because we could really retire soon. The problem is not, again, the principles per se, but the fact that we're putting people into principalship jobs without any training on their board policies, the law, due process, alternative behavioral models and discipline models. You're putting school resource officers in, well-intended, but without any clear memorandum of understanding, any guidelines on differentiating their roles, which should be from discipline versus law enforcement. I'm not saying that law enforcement should be in arresting children. I'm not saying there aren't some questionable cases. But the solution isn't necessarily your law to ban police. The solution is get your police department and your school district should be following what's been well-established best practices in the field for years in their memorandum of understanding and training. And this all comes around to the fact that Susan and I are probably, here in particular, talking about things, and representatives alluded to it as well. We're talking about things probably the day after Columbine and the weeks after Columbine that we were saying as well. But think about it. We're here in 2013, and you have a whole new generation of superintendents, principals, teachers, school boards, and kids. The kids who were in kindergarten at the time of Columbine 14 years ago, we had a whole generation that are out. You have more new principals and superintendents in their position and teachers where the fundamental best practices that Susan's talking about, the reporting, getting kids to report that we harped about for years after Columbine, they haven't heard that harping again. And we're going back to not to put words in Susan's mouth, but I think what we're both saying is we're going back to square one. So are we focusing on the fundamentals, and are all the things that's being pitched to you, lobbied to you, and that you're well-intended proposing in legislation, are they really dealing with focusing on the fundamentals? And my answer is, by and large, we haven't seen that. So I encourage you, as you look at policy and funding, be cautious of having discussions on high-level, low-impact considerations. For example, does the entertainment industry and the media play a role in the influence of child behavior? Absolutely. I mean, I don't need to cite research. I can look at my youngest little guy and how in his after he plays an electronic game or gets a half hour of a certain, I'm avoiding naming certain channels here just to get out of the, not get pulled into politics of that, but just certain basic child entertainment channels. However, is that going to help a principal make their school better next week after you pass a law? We can address those issues, we can talk about it, but I think it needs to be dissected legislatively, has been well done in Connecticut, to give the people some help now, in addition to the high-level conversations. Be careful of all the fads, feel-good things with no practical implementation. Let's teach kids to just run. In the Navy the other day, they sheltered in place. They didn't throw staplers at the armed gunman and go and just run, all run everywhere. Many people in Navy Command are locked down. Not that lockdown's the only alternative, but you have to assess the situation. But we have people now going in post-Sandy Hook telling kids, well, anything happens, just run. Well, what are you running into? Another gunman down the hall? Or that soup can that you're going to pull out? We had a kid in a Catholic school in southern Ohio that pulled out a gun with the intent of an attempted suicide. Had that class been trained in Alice or the attack mode, what would have happened if another child stood up and threw a can of soup at him? It would have been from suicidal to homicidal for sure. So what are we thinking about how these things are implemented? Please be cautious not to skew policy and funding as an option to having comprehensive, and be cautious with overly prescriptive and recognize that local flexibility. I've seen, the bottom line, and I know you hear it all the time, is that many of the things that have been proposed are unfunded, unmonitored, and unenforced. And that's certainly a great concern. Look at Michigan, for example. Go back to mlive.com, the online news reporting. They did an investigative story a few months ago looking at all the state-mandated drills that schools had to conduct. And what they discovered by analyzing public records is that school administrators in some districts, one school district, they had 12 fire drills or 9 fire drills in the month of June. They checked the box, they did them, they were in compliance with state laws, but is that most effective? One school district copied the dates from the prior year and actually told the state that they were doing their drills on Sundays and holidays and other times when they weren't even in schools. So I think, again, we have to look at whether there's compliance, meaningful compliance with the spirit as well as the letter of the law. So what can we think on a positive thing? What are some things that we can do? One of the things that I've found that has been the most effective, meaningful, budget-considerate models has been the Indiana School Safety Specialist Academy. State of Indiana, back in 98, it was just prior to Columbine. At that point, I'd been doing a lot of training with the Indiana Department of Ed, and the governor's education, Governor O'Bannon's education aide came to me and a colleague in Indiana and said, what could we do that would be meaningful? Started a conversation where we proposed and was eventually incorporated into law some very good things that Indiana is still doing today. One requirement is that each school in the state, each school corporation in the state have a designated school safety specialist. That specialist is required to take in a certain amount of training and updates each year through the Indiana School Safety Specialist Academy. And that training ranges from dealing with bullying and prevention and climate issues to tactical law enforcement, social media, and they adapt their curriculum over time. And next week, I'll be speaking again at the Basic Academy. 14, going on 15 years, losing my clock, about 15 years since it was actually enacted in 99. 14 years later, they've maintained their original operating budget, line item in the state budget, $750,000. It hasn't been politicized. It hasn't been cut, or it hasn't grown, something I'm sure legislatively you all could appreciate. And for under $1 million a year, next week, they're at a record high of having 700 people. School districts are sending multiple people for this training and taking stuff back to their districts, putting it to work with best practices. There's still gaps, but it's something at the state level I thought that was really good, meaningful, and useful. As you look at mandating crisis plans and drills, take a look at the accountability factor at the state level. We have seen some states where state auditors have gone in, and there have been some isolated audits of Attorney General's office and others seeing if schools are in compliance. Take a look at not only having the incentive, but also the teeth that goes with it. Otherwise, you're just creating another system where you're going to have principals spending more time checking a form to send to the state superintendent that they did something when they should be out of their office in the hallways dealing with bullying, practicing these drills. Strengthening school resource officers, physical security, and training. Again, balance your staffing and your infrastructure with training your people. All of that great technology. And one of the things that we saw after Sandy Hook, without the official report still coming out, fortify the main front door. My first question is, what about your other 36 doors around your schools? If I really want to get into a school where I goes to the cafeteria, the gym area, or the custodial delivery areas. But people have gotten tunnel vision focused, which standing alone, it's not a bad thing to reconfigure your entranceways, do some structural design, beefing up your access control. That standing alone is not a bad thing. But schools have gotten such tunnel vision focus on that, they haven't been training their staff when a stranger gets in the rest of the building. Exercise caution in using safety data. There is no federal mandatory school crime reporting and tracking for pre-K through 12 schools. There are a number of academic studies, research studies, and other types of things that are out there, but even the federal government statistics are very limited in sources. They're a hodgepodge collection of a half a dozen studies, not actual incident-based data. So you have to take that data with a grain of salt. Linking at the state level, can you link your education, homeland security, emergency management, justice, and mental health departments, as was referenced from Connecticut and in Colorado, can different agencies, so that they're talking the same talk and developing policy and funding that's not skewed and not distorted, one area or the other. And finally, the litmus test I suggest that you make as you look at legislation really comes down to three things. Number one, how does this help a principal better secure her or his building and better prepare for emergencies? Number two, what are the implications for implementation, whether that's mental health or school safety? And number three, is it practical and helpful to those on the front line, not serving special interests or higher political agendas and using school safety as a tool? I have a number of resources that are in your handouts. So on the website, facebook.com/school safety is our school safety news channel. And I just leave you with one of my favorite quotes is, "He is most free from danger who, even when safe, is on his guard."